Thank you. This is not the talk that the InfoSec world deserves, but it is the one that it needs right now. And I'm Lily, that's my Twitter handle, and we need to talk about passwords. So if you follow tech news in any capacity, you hear every couple of days about databases of username and password combinations being dumped all over the place with a heavy use of the words cyber and dark web and probably a picture of someone in a hoodie or a lot of zeros and ones scrolling up a screen with the word password somewhere in it, because the cybers are scary. And we all know that yesterday's Cloud Bleed vulnerability disclosure means that we probably should all go and change all our passwords right now, if you haven't already. And if you've been using the internet for a while, you will have noticed that passwords kind of suck. And if you've been in InfoSec for a while, you will know that passwords really suck. And we all kind of take the presence for passwords for granted. You sign up for a new email address, your password. You start a new job, you log in with a new password. You sign up for Netflix, you get a password, and you probably put that password on your fridge because the whole household shares it, hopefully next to the Wi-Fi password that you also hopefully have. And we know that the most common passwords are still password and 1234566. And we know that most people use the same password for multiple accounts because it's easier to remember that way. And we know that a non-zero number of people will write those passwords on a Post-it note and put it on their monitor because that is also easier to remember. And while I get that this isn't as cool or as intellectually stimulating as being hacked by the latest zero-day vulnerability, basic password compromise is still the most common way to get hacked. It is, and it's boring, but it's still happening. But it's important, and how we got here is important. And I want to tell you about how we got here for two reasons. So the first one, as some of you know, as Patrick said, in addition to being a consultant and breaking code and writing identity systems, I am also a historian, and I'm interested in how we got to where we are, and most importantly, why we keep doing this to ourselves. And the second and probably more urgent reason to tell you about this is because I'm bored of hearing about passwords all the time. Passwords are a crap technology with several different crappy implementations. And I'd rather be doing something way more exciting than telling people to install password managers over and over and over again. And the reason I want to tell you folks about this is because we are the ones that have the ability to fix it. We're your IT folk, and your sysadmins, and your pen testers, and sometimes your developers, and sometimes we're consultants, and sometimes we work in-house, and sometimes we're the one that relatives ring up because they can't open their Microsoft Word documents. And it's totally up to us to use our influence to fix these things for everybody. So here's a horrible history of awful passwords, followed by a list of 5 ways that we can stop doing this over and over again because, seriously. And I'm using images here from the 1922 movie Nosferatu, which is one of the first vampire movies ever made. Because, like vampires, the story of passwords is life-sucking and it keeps you awake at night in terror. And also because most password policies are about as well-written as Twilight. Right. So, story time. Once upon a time, there was a password. And this password was Open Sesame. And it protected a cave where a bunch of thieves hid some stuff that they had stolen. There was no two-factor auth on this cave. One day, a guy called Ali Baba was in the neighborhood and he saw the thieves saying Open Sesame and getting into the cave. And he decided to exploit this by waiting until all the thieves had left and saying Open Sesame and getting into the cave. And when he was in there, he took a bag of gold from all of the stuff that they had stolen, and he left. And he used it to buy a new house and probably a really cool set of speakers. And things were good until the thieves found out what he'd done, and they decided to kill him. So they came after him, and after a long and protracted dramatic set of events, which is mainly the point of this story, but not for right now, Ali Baba killed all of them. And then he was the only one who knew the password to the cave, which is how it should have been from the start, really. And this story, which usually goes by the name of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, is allegedly thousands of years old, but at least 300 years old, so it's still pretty old. But here's another one that's less old than that, but slightly older than the internet. Once upon a time, in the coldest part of the Cold War, there was a president of an America. And this president decided that the United States stockpile of nuclear weapons should probably have some kind of code or protection on them so that they didn't get set off by accident or by just anybody, which would probably be bad. So the president asked his Secretary of Defense to make that happen. And the Secretary of Defense made it mandatory for there to be a passcode lock on all of the big red buttons that made the world go boom. And it would have to be communicated, this code, from the president down through so that it could be set off by authorization. And the guy who was in charge of Strategic Air Command thought that this was a really stupid idea. So because he had to implement these passcodes, he did, but he made them all a string of 8 zeros everywhere. And that's why I'm pretty sure we're living in some kind of rare splinter universe, because we all survived that somehow, and nothing ever exploded. And because the world survived to make more bad password decisions, here is one more story for you. Once upon a time, there was a guy called Alan, who was a PhD student at MIT. MIT had a computer, and much like my childhood, there was only one of them. And everybody wanted to use it all of the time. And presumably this was because they wanted to, like my childhood, play Roller Coaster Tycoon, I don't know. So MIT decided what most parents decide, which is that sharing is nice. So they decided to divide up the computer time among everybody and give them hour blocks here and there. And in order to make sure that they adhered to this time, each person had to log on at the start of their time with a password, and then at the end of the time they would get kicked off and the next person could start. And Alan had been given 4 hours a week on this computer, which was pretty good for 1962, but not good enough for the research that Alan was doing. So he had a look around on the computer and he discovered a file called password. And in it were all the passwords and the usernames that went with them in plain text. So he printed out this file, and when his time came to an end, he just logged on with the next one. And he dumped all of this data among all the students at MIT, well, PhD students, so that everybody else could use all of the passwords, which would draw suspicion away from him. And that's the end of that story. It never got any better. The ancient Greek warfare strategist Aeneas Tacticus once said that good passwords are easy to remember. The login system for my bank once said that good passwords need to be between 8 and 16 characters, have one uppercase letter and one lowercase letter, and a special character, but not something weird like a tilde or a character with an umlaut in it, or, God forbid, an emoji. Because passwords which use fancy characters like that are very bad passwords that will be sent to bed without dessert. And I use the past tense when I read this, when I say this, because when I read this, I switched banks. So the moral of this story, of all of these stories, is that we never really got to this point with regard to passwords. We have always been kind of where we are. We just made passwords more and more mandatory to get anything done when they've always been a pain in the butt. And security is not something that most people think about at all, as I'm sure we all know. And because, and we all lived horribly ever after, the end, because this system sucks most of the time. And we all know it sucks, and we all know that we can do better. And most of us try. We enable multi-factor authentication for all of our accounts, and we use a password manager, and we generate long passwords. And we know that really the length of a password, combined with the unpredictability, like a bunch of random words, usually makes that password harder to crack than a short one with special characters in it. But not everybody knows that. And it's everybody else who builds and uses the internet most of the time. So if we want to get it right for us, we have to get it right for them too. So here are some recommendations for 5 things that you can do as technical people, as InfoSec people, to make this all kind of slightly better. Firstly, salt and hash your passwords. If you're working on a system that doesn't do this, please make it do this. And for those who are unsure of how to do this or might need to update their systems after the SHA-1 collision yesterday, here's a quick recap. Here's an average password. Somebody uses this password for an account on your system, so your system needs to store it. However, we don't want to store this in plain text, or the PhD student Allens of the world will do what they've been doing since 1962. So we need to add some salt. Salt in this case means a random string that you will append to the end, sometimes beginning, usually the end, of a password before you store it in your system, and it should be a little bit long. It should also be unique, meaning that you don't use it for all of your passwords in all of your systems, and private, meaning you don't publish this anywhere. And then before you store it, you run the password and salt together through a hashing algorithm, and then get the output of that algorithm, and then store that in your database. And please don't roll your own hashing algorithm. There are plenty to choose from. And please don't use SHA-1. Thank you. This one uses SHA-256. So if you hash and salt all of the passwords that you were storing, even if your password database gets leaked, it makes it harder for an attacker to find out what the password is by comparing the hash to other hashes, et cetera, et cetera. And they'll have to guess the salt. It makes their task infinity times harder. Probably less than that. I don't know. I didn't run the numbers. It's hard. OK, second thing, multi-factor authentication. Implement this on every system that you work on that you can. Universal second factor, or U2F, is probably the least awful second factor implementation out there. So use that. So for those who aren't across it, this requires a physical key, like a YubiKey, that speaks directly to your browser and uses a bunch of public key cryptography to uniquely identify you when you log in with your account. It also requires you to touch the keypad on the physical key once to prove that there's an actual human at the other end who authorized that decision, which makes it harder for a bot to hack your account, which is nice. And there's a lot of, it can't be cloned. There's a lot of ridiculously cool stuff that goes on under the hood there, which I'm not going to get into right now, but find me later if you want to talk about it if you're not across it already. And if you can't implement that, at least don't implement something that sends a code over SMS, because this is vulnerable as all get out. And the fact that we're adding all of our phone numbers to all of our accounts is already starting to bite us in the butt. I've got a rant on that for another time, but anyway. OK, third one, make more than one multi-factor auth method available to the people who use your systems. So U2F and a one-time password, they make things even harder for people to break into, but they don't make them 100% impossible. Nothing ever, ever, ever does. However, implementing this stuff does make it harder for the average attacker to do something. This is good. Yeah, OK, fourth, help your clients write their password policies. Help them write good password policies that emphasize length, usually a minimum length instead of a maximum length. Make that about 20, more, whatever. Give your users automatic feedback on the passwords they're trying to submit. Base that on your password policy instead of how many fancy characters you can fit into a short string of characters. Tell your clients about Diceware passwords. Tell your clients about password managers. And if you're feeling really mean, make your required minimum 50 characters so you force them to use password managers, which is a lot easier if you're running an internal corporate system where you could actually know everybody. But anyway. All right, and the fifth thing is to rethink the idea of working on systems that use biometric authentication as the only method of authentication. So I have yet another rant about biometric authentication, which is, again, for another time. But the long and short of it is that if your password gets compromised, you can change it. If your fingerprint gets compromised, it is hard to grow new fingers. And this isn't even going into the users who are locked out of this system because they don't have fingers to begin with. Biometrics and accessibility do not play nicely together, and that is bad. And we keep coming up with new ways to steal and fake biometric information all the time. So Adobe released software, which was very kind of them, that allows you to write whatever you want and have somebody say it in their own voice, given, say, 20 minutes of audio sample of that person speaking. Japanese researchers last month came out with research that proved that the average smartphone camera can get details of fingerprints from about 3 meters away if the lighting is good enough. That's fun. And biometric auth looks really cool in the movies, but the movies are also where people get their eyeballs removed to bypass it, so there's that. OK, so to recap, salt and hash, use MFA. U2F is great. SMS is not so great. Enable more than one type of MFA. Write proper password policies, and please say no to biometrics if at all possible. And these are only small things, and this is a big problem, and they're small, and I know. And they won't make the world perfect, and they won't make people completely unhackable either, but they will make tiny steps in that direction, and that is how we get there. And I would love a happy ending to the horror story of passwords. So please help me write one. Thank you.